So hello, everybody. Good morning, everybody, again, wherever you are in the world at the moment. Hello to panel 7. Again, panel 7 is on policies for a green recovery for the building sector. So we are mainly talking about policies for the transition of the building sector. My name is Veit Bürger. I am one of the panel leaders. I work for the Öko Institute, which is an independent environmental research institute in Germany. The panel is co-hosted by Jan Rosenow. Many of you might know him, working for the regulatory assistant projects, but unfortunately Jan can't join us today for family reasons, and he's very sorry about this, but he sends his warmest regards to all of you. So we had already super exciting presentations in the last 2 days, and we will simply continue today in the same way. So this first slot this morning is on financial aspects regarding the transformation of the building sector. And we have 3 very interesting presentations today. 2 of them are recorded, 1 is live. One technical issue in the beginning: if you have any questions to the panelists, then I would really ask you to, and would like to encourage you to send and to submit questions. And you do that via the Wova app. In the Wova app, there is a question answer section. Please use that. I will collect all your questions and put them forward to the panelists. So, and we will start right away with the first presentation. The first presentation is provided by Uri Batzaikan. Uri is working for Positive Money Europe, which is a non-profit research and campaigning organization which is based in Brussels. And Uri is talking about unlocking housing renovation with green TLTROs. Uri, you have the floor.
Hello, my name is Urinte Batsahan, and thank you very much for accepting our paper to this conference. And I'm happy to present our report that was published in February of this year, and it concerns financing of the energy efficient building renovations, one of the ways to finance renovations. First of all, a few words about our organization. We're called Positive Money Europe, and we are a campaigning, research, and advocacy organization directed mainly at lobbying the European Central Bank to make their operations more transparent, democratic, and sustainable. And we've been in operation, as you can see, since 2015. First of all, a few words on the background of the operations of the European Central Bank. Since the global financial crisis and the crisis in the Eurozone, ECB has been on a massive, what you would call implementing kind of massive unconventional policies, which is known to the public as quantitative easing, in other words, asset purchase programs. And as you can see, as of 2020, the balance sheet of the European Central Bank is around 7 trillion euros. And it's been increasing, of course, with the Corona crisis pandemic as well. As you can see on the graph, it's the big chunk of it is quantitative easing, asset purchase programs of government bonds, as well as corporate bonds and asset-backed securities purchase program. And another important channel through which the ECB operates is so-called the telstra. Telstra stand for targeted longer-term refinancing operations. It's basically how the ECB provides financing to banks in the euro area. So it's loans to banks. The telstra operations, as you can see, have been increasing quite a lot, starting from 2019, and it's been increasing ever since. So the telstra are basically how the ECB gives money to banks, and you can call it bank funding on steroids, especially since the pandemic. The first telstra operations, telstra 1, started in 2014 after the euro area crisis, but it really accelerated from 2016. So far, there's been major, telstra 1 to 3 operations. 2.5 trillion euros were provided to banks in the euro area. With a large chunk of it, almost 2 trillion provided since the COVID-19 pandemic. And President Lagarde said that there will be 3 more telstra operations scheduled in 2021. And as you can see in the graph, in March 2021, the last telstra operation, banks got 331 billion euros across euro area to lend to the real economy. So how it works is that banks borrow in the amount to 55% of their lending. And these are longer duration, so 4 years. And the most important caveat, the most important feature of the program is that banks borrow at the normal rate of minus 0.5%. However, if banks can demonstrate that their lending has stayed the same over a certain amount of time, then they can borrow up to negative 1%. So in other words, basically the European Central Bank subsidizes banks to lend to the real economy up to, so banks make a profit by lending to the real economy by keeping the lending constant. The major problem with the telstra is that at the moment there is no climate or environmental criteria attached to lending. So if the banks lend to renewables or if they lend to a coal plant, they can still borrow from the ECB. This comes, so our proposal comes at a very opportune time, because at the same time the European Commission announced the Renovation Wave initiative. And it's an ambitious project to provide the kind of the legislative requirements, the technical expertise. However, in terms of the funding, the scale of funding that is needed to reach the targets of the Green Deal and the Renovation Wave is falling quite short. And there we propose the telstra to be the kind of the fuel that propels the renovation wave. Furthermore, bank-based scalable financing is the thing that the telstra can provide for the renovation wave. So how would the renovation telstra work? So basically, now the renovation loans are part of the consumer loans. So there's a lot of research that says it's expensive for consumers to borrow and expensive for banks to provide funding, because it's on a small scale. It's not cost efficient, and so we propose to separate the renovation telstra, the renovation loans from the consumer loans. And one important caveat here is that the telstra do not apply on mortgage loans. So that, I mean, understandably, the ECB does not want to fuel a housing bubble. So mortgage loans are not eligible for telstra. So how would the renovation telstra work is that if the banks provide loans for energy efficient renovation projects, then they get a rate that is below even the -1%. This would offer an incentive for banks to reach out to customers, but also it would be cheaper for customers to borrow from the bank for renovation purposes, because at the moment it's very expensive. Additional discounts could be offered if banks achieve a lending performance threshold in line with the EU strategy. So every country has their developing their renovation country strategy. So if they meet the strategy, an additional discount could be maybe applied, and the increase in the duration of the telstra, which is currently 4 years, increase it to the timing it takes for renovation projects to pay off, which is sometimes quite a long term. So how would this benefit the consumers and the banks and the governments? Is that for banks, costless access to funding. Basically, if the funding they get from the telstra, from the ECB, is offered at a deeply discounted rate, the interest rate that they apply on renovation loans to the public could significantly decrease. This also covers the transaction costs for renovation projects for banks. And in the hope that if the customers are encouraged to take out these renovation projects and it becomes cheaper, then as with scale, their cost per one, let's say, loan portfolio would decrease as well for the bank. And we also think that incentive to deploy the network of bank branches as distributed network of one-stop shops will also aggregate knowledge and technical expertise. And for consumers, this would facilitate the process of setting up renovation projects for millions of households and businesses. So this would basically mean a very bottom-up, privately funded, cheaply funded incentive that could reach millions of people at the same time as this would reach people who have existing loans with the bank, and most of the people are banked in the euro area, and in the hope that this will also increase deep renovations instead of going for lighter ones, because the existing research says that people fund their renovation projects mostly with their own capital, which means they wait until they have sufficient funds available to fund the projects. And the biggest obstacle to private funding is for customers is that it is expensive. And for governments, by kind of increasing the tap of private funding, the public funding could be redirected to and existing subsidies, which is quite substantial. Subsidies could be redirected to increasing the skills and expertise, to social housing, targeted and increased support for low-income households, as well as reskilling programs to the scale that is needed to reach the objectives of the Green Deal with so much workers and so much capacity that it still is missing. For the ECB, it would mean better transmission of monetary policy towards greener, sustainable, and productive bank lending. For banks, this would mean that their portfolio including their mortgage portfolio and loan portfolio, will become more sustainable. And so it will ease the risks of transition for them. And both for the ECB and the Commission, they would get a step closer to Paris alignment and deliver the Green Deal ambitions. So this year is crucial, not only because there is the EPPD consultation going on, there's the renovation wave incentive, but also on the ECB side. They are conducting their strategy review. The last one took place in 2003, so it's been 17 years. It was launched in January 2020 and set to finish in the fall of 2021. And it covers all aspects of monetary policy within the framework of the mandate, including climate change that President Lagarde is herself passionate about. Furthermore, we got a signal from the ECB that green telstra, so greening the telstra program, including the renovation telstra, is a matter that is of interest, and that we will look at it. It's a quote from President Lagarde. So what I want to conclude with is that there is a rare alignment of interest between the ECB, the European Commission, member states, companies, and we spoke to banks and consumers to really accelerate the pace of renovations. And it will take just one kind of policy step to reach this, to kind of provide the funding to open the tap for private financing. And the ECB strategy review, due to end this year, is a unique opportunity to promote this proposal. And the next steps for us is we are conducting further research together with the consumer organizations, together with the banks. And we are also doing further advocacy aimed at the Commission, the Parliament, and we are also conducting campaign in the form of petitions to general public to get their support. And just to conclude, we will be working on this in the future, and we welcome any expression of interest in our work, and you are welcome to contact me at my email address here, and I welcome any questions in this regard. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Yuri. Thank you for this very, very interesting and very exciting presentation. I'm not a financial expert, and I'm really honest. For me, it was really very interesting to read through your paper and to learn about your proposal. So you mentioned that the European Central Bank, that they already said that green TLTROs are a matter of interest. But did you have already more detailed discussions with them about that? Whether your concept is something which they really think about and analyze in depth, and whether there is a realistic chance that we get to that?
So thank you very much for your question. As I've mentioned in the presentation, they're conducting their strategy review, and this is pretty much a very not very transparent process at the moment. So they will release their findings at the end of fall, or perhaps even later. But until then, they have signaled a commitment to look into this issue. And we are trying on our side, we're trying to kind of gather this, as we wrote in the paper, a technical group to see whether the proposal is feasible, and this will include people from the Commission, people from the ECB, and other institutions, as well as NGOs and research organizations. So it's still a process, and perhaps it's still in quite early stages, but yeah, we're doing everything on our side to conduct more research, to conduct widespread campaigns and advocacy towards the European institutions.
What's the role of the member states in this discussion? So do they have a deep influence on the whole process, or do they just observe the process? So would it be also wise? So from my understanding, you're also trying to campaign in favor of this concept. So would it also be a strategy to try to get member state governments to push for your proposal?
Yeah, definitely. So in order to bring change at the ECB, you need to lobby basically the member states, so the Euro system, so national central banks as well. And in that regard, we're trying to gather support in member states that are actively involved in renovations and have made progress and in favor of greening the telstra program. So we are working towards member states as well, and central banks in member states mostly, because in the end it's their vote that counts to change to green the telstras. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. So, from as far as I understand, your concept is you try to ease the way to financing by incentivizing banks really to give out loans for good conditions for refurbishment measures. But the precondition for the whole concept is that these renovations pay off after a certain time, so that you really can refinance them through the energy savings. When we talk about really deep retrofits, at least at the current energy price level, to be honest, some of the deep retrofits won't finance or pay off at all, or it takes rather long years, 20, 30, 40 years to really refinance the initial investment. So how do you deal with this barrier? How can your concept also, because I saw on one of the slides you said that this concept is also supporting to increase the number of deep renovations instead of insufficient renovations processes. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes, that's a good question. And as you know, we're not really experts in energy renovations, but rather in monetary policy, really. And our belief is that if we look at the current situation, it's renovation loans are part of the consumer loans. So unlike mortgages, which you can get at very low interest rates because mortgages are securitized, loans you cannot. So if we can provide this kind of if we can provide the risk that the banks are taking by providing renovation loans, if we can subsidize that part, we believe that it would be sufficiently cheap for a consumer to take out this loan. And in terms of your research about the payoff period, I think this is still a matter of research to say what specific situations demand specific actions, how long it takes for the renovation loan to pay off. And in that regard, we propose extending the period of the telstras to meet the very long period that it takes the renovation loan to pay off. And if we can increase the scale, then the unit costs will decrease, which is our belief. But definitely there is more research needed in this regard.
Okay, thank you. So one brief final question. Do you already have an idea about the energy requirements that you would ask for in order to get banks to get access to this cheap money from the EZB? So do you work on the financial side on the one hand side, but do you also have concrete specific ideas about the minimum energy requirements that would be the condition in order to get this cheaper money?
So at the moment, as far as I understand, banks ask whoever wants to get a loan to get an energy certificate and how much loan they require for them to kind of jump one stage. I think that's a matter of technical expertise, and of course, looking at financing side, we also need to look at the technical expertise. And in that regard, there's quite a lot, and we propose that increasing the technical expertise of banking officers as well will pay off very much. And it's our hope that it would be also possible to do that with private financing or some kind of private-public financing channels.
Okay, thank you. I have the feeling that also calls for more collaborations between the financial research and the energy climate policy research. So
definitely,
that's something for the future. Thank you, Judy, very, very much. And we might come back to you in the final session. So we need to go to the next presentation. The next presentation is provided by Anthony Brito. He's an economist as well. He's working for the Karlsruhe Institute for Technology. His presentation is about optimal investment in energy efficiency as a problem of wealth growth, rate maximization, evidence and policy implications. Anthony is presenting live, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Veit. I hope you can see and hear me well, the screen and everything. It's a pleasure to be with you all at the eceee 21. I'm going to be talking today about a paper that was accepted, work that I've done with my supervisor, Joris de la Holland, where we essentially tried to understand, as the title says, optimal investment in energy efficiency as a problem of wealth growth rate maximization. So before I get into the details of that investment model, maybe just a few words about an economist's motivation for considering this problem at all. I'm in fact a theoretical physicist by training, so I'm kind of new to this whole thing. But I was fascinated by the idea of the energy efficiency gap, sometimes known as the energy efficiency paradox. And this is sort of the classic way that economists would picture this or think about this. This is from a paper from the 90s. And the idea is that between your baseline or business as usual energy level, so what we have today, and your hypothetical potential, where you could imagine that every house in Germany, so I'll be focusing on the German case, every house in Germany was immediately upgraded to a passive house standard, that there are several possible levels of energy efficiency diffusion, the diffusion of this technology that could be attained rather. And so one example will be the economist's economic potential, where you would simply eliminate market failures such as information loss, the landlord-tenant dilemma, and so on. And then you would allow the market to determine what the optimal level of energy efficiency is. And then there are others. Perhaps the most interesting one is the true social optimum, where you would, in addition to market failures, you would internalize emissions via a carbon tax and so on. In any case, looking at the literature, I realized that this picture was even more complicated than is sometimes admitted by researchers, because if you picture this diagram moving sideways in time, not only is the business or business as usual or baseline energy efficiency level changing, but each of these potentials are changing as more information is gathered. And what ends up, the conclusion is that the path from the baseline to any one of these potentials is in fact a path through space and time. And so I settled on if I was to summarize my research gap in a sentence, I realized that the temporal and the stochastic or random aspect, right? Like, I mean, the energy efficiency gap ultimately relies on the prices of commodities, and these are stochastic. And there seems to be a dearth of models that adequately deal with the temporal and the time aspect of this, and it'll be clear what I mean with this in a moment. Discounted cash flow models, for example, they can't answer the question of optimal investment timing. So how can you model a diffusion process? How can you model a process by which a consumer defers an investment until he has more information, for example, if your investment model is only a now or never decision tool? And so in the end, I asked a very simple question. So from these abstract considerations, I came back down to earth and asked, how can I answer the consumer who asks me when and how much should I invest in energy efficiency? So what, given the current market conditions and certain assumptions, what's the best time and how much should I put in? So before I go to the model, maybe just a few words about the stylized facts on energy efficiency investment that for me were an indication that this temporal aspect is important. The first is that there's a substantial variation in annual retrofit uptake. And this graphic on the right is an indication of this. So this is government spending on subsidies in millions of euros from 2001 to 2019. And while there's a clear upward trend, there's also a substantial variation. So I think this is a really interesting fact, and note that this is not small. So, you know, subsidies can differ by a few $100 million. So consumers really seem to be affected by forces that would be interesting for anyone to understand. Other indicators are that homeowners tend to wait out the lifetime of their equipment and then add on an anyway energy efficiency upgrade. So a sowieso upgrade for the German speakers. I mean, this is understandable from a behavioral point of view, but are there economic reasons for just waiting for your equipment to run out, to run its course? Also, with regards to the heating system, movement between energy carriers is extremely infrequent. And if movement does take place, it's in the direction of gas heating. And then finally, and this has less to do with the temporal aspect and more to do with another thing that was interesting to me in the whole energy efficiency or building retrofit debate, was the fact that consumers invest far more in shallow and light retrofits than they do in medium and deep. And this is also a fact that I've noticed gets lost in the discussion. Sometimes people talk about just an average rate of 1% per year in Germany, and it's not exactly correct. So this study, this was an EU study done during years of heightened renovation activity, but the total renovation rate is closer to 10%. But the medium and deep retrofits, which comprise really 30 to 60% energy savings and above, these are far lower than very light retrofits that consumers take on. So. Okay, so we'll return to these facts in a moment. So the decision model that I built, and this is perhaps too technical for a 15-minute presentation. The only thing I want to indicate here is that I turned to an emerging branch of economics called ergodicity economics, which basically posits that a consumer maximizes the time average of the growth rate of their wealth. And so the time average is a new way of dealing with randomness, of dealing with stochasticity. And instead of just maximizing wealth, you maximize the growth rate of wealth. So if a consumer's wealth grows multiplicatively, just to show you how something like this is derived, your wealth has some process, so your wealth changes in time, and from the wealth dynamic, which is this equation, you can derive the growth rate as a function of the utility function, so as a function of utility, and you can extract this. You can do this for any given wealth process, including one where energy costs are part of the wealth dynamic. And so I took this idea and I combined it with the econophysical reality of diminishing marginal utility, which is simply, you know, the first centimeter of insulation is the most important to obtain a growth rate function of wealth. And it's a little bit complicated. It looks a little bit complicated, but it's not really. Essentially, all it is from my growth rate of wealth delta, I subtract the sum of my energy costs before the retrofit itself, and then post retrofit. And so since this is a convex function in K and T, I in fact can locate a K star T star at which this growth rate is maximized. And this is the answer to my how much and when. Notice also that in contrast to a net present value or discounted cash flow method, your starting wealth W0 and growth rate delta are part of the optimization. So it really matters where you start. And I wanted to show you that briefly with this table. So suppose I'm looking at a single family home built in the early 80s, and that fixes the physical parameters of the problem. They're heating with oil. And I ask how much incentive there is to invest in a heat pump. And again, I fix the fuel price parameters and the efficiency of the heating system. And then I can generate a table like this. So the starting wealth, these are the top 3 wealthiest quantiles in Germany. And here I just have some example growth rates. And here in parentheses, I've indicated K star and T star. So investment depth in euros per meter squared, and then this is time in years from present. And you notice that if you look down a given column, so if you fix delta, but the consumer is wealthier, K star and T star increase, but the increase in K star is less significant. So the wealthier consumer invests slightly more, but at a much later point in time. So 7.5 years versus 15 years. And if you look along a given row, so if you fix W0, you see that as delta increases, K star decreases, but T star increases. So the consumer invests less and later, the faster her wealth grows. So again, from 7.4 years from present to maybe waits 20 years from present. So I mean, essentially, this is like no investment at all, right? So I just wanted to indicate that these are highly non-trivial wealth effects that just kind of fall out of the mathematics in this investment model. So the purpose of the paper that I submitted to eceee was to scale this investment model up to the building stock to the best of my ability. So I used wealth data from the Bundesbank, as I indicated, fuel price data. I used some representative buildings. The tabulated database should be known to some of you. And a renovation calculator to estimate these diminishing marginal utility curves. And all in all, this covers about 21% of the residential building stock in Germany. And then you can generate graphs that look like this. And on the y-axis is the share of the total building stock in percentage. My sample, as I say, is about 21%. And then these bars indicate the renovation potential in my various scenarios. So I have growth rate scenarios for wealth, 2.5%, 3%, and 5%. Perhaps the thing that immediately we have to admit is that the growth rate of wealth matters enormously. So the difference between wealth growing at 2.5% and 5% in terms of renovation potential is just enormous. And this just is another word of caution for benchmarking the energy efficiency gap. It turned out to be very difficult. But on the other hand, there are trends that we can observe despite this difficulty, which are very interesting for the social planner. The first is that consumers whose wealth grows faster have less incentive across the board to retrofit deeply, or to upgrade their heating systems. On the other hand, the substantial annual variation is reproducible. So it turns out it's not totally random. Like these, I had no free parameters in my model apart from this growth rate thing. And I'm able to generate most of the qualitative aspects of the curve that I showed you, of the subsidy curves, the subsidy levels that I showed you in one of the earlier slides. So it's a real reproducible thing that's worth paying attention to. In the delta equals 2.5 scenario, for example, regarding the retrofit depth or diminishing marginal utility, you see that the ratio of medium retrofits to deep retrofits to retrofits, including a heater upgrade or switch, is 65%, 29%, and 6%. So here we see evidence that in fact it doesn't make sense for most consumers to upgrade their heaters. It makes sense for them to just do a retrofit instead. And for this small percentage of people who do retrofit their heaters, upgrade their heaters, about 75% move to gas and 25% stay with oil. So again, we're able to reproduce the heater trends that we talked about earlier. The other thing that I did with my model was to run some policy experiments, carbon taxes, and I looked at carbon taxes and subsidies, and to eliminate the element of randomness, I just ran these with the fuel price data that we already have from 91 through today. Carbon pricing was as per the new scheme in Germany, which is active from this year, and the subsidies are modeled on the KfW scheme. And then you can generate curves that look like this. They're similar to the previous graph, except that here I'm now plotting the difference, the baseline scenario. So how much excess retrofit potential am I generating because of the carbon tax? And once again, some sample results, you see that the effects of taxes and subsidies shrink the faster wealth grows. So we all kind of intuitively understand it's harder to make wealthier people do things. And now we can quantitatively show this or explain this. The effectiveness of both policies depends strongly on the fuel price. So this random element does not simply disappear just because you have policies in place. Heater upgrades continue to be largely uneconomical despite steep discounts. For those of you who are aware of the German schemes, up to 45% discounts are offered on heat pumps, but it turns out to not make a difference. Taxes seem to be more effective, in fact, in generating incentive. Deep retrofits remain stubbornly uneconomically viable in almost all cases. In the delta equals 5% scenario, for example, not a single dwelling, even in the presence of both carbon taxes and subsidies, invests in a deep retrofit. And this alludes to what Veit mentioned earlier about deep retrofits being difficult to justify from a financial point of view. On the other hand, interestingly enough, there seems to be a kind of symbiosis effect, a synergy. The policy instruments achieve more in tandem than the sum of their individual parts. So that's a hopeful sign. It'll be interesting to see what data we're able to gather starting from this year when taxes and subsidies are going to work together. So what are the main policy implications? And again, this was a very simple model, so I've tried to keep my policy implications also general. But in a sentence for the social planner, I would just say wealth matters, the diminishing marginal utility of retrofitting matters, and that stochasticity, which is something that's beyond the social planner's control, unfortunately also really seems to matter. And so some concrete implications for the German context would be a greater recognition of the role of the dynamics of household wealth. It seems as though there's a great intuitive understanding. There's been a lot of work done on energy poverty, but quantitative models have been hard to come by. And I hope that this work is a step in that direction. Policymakers can work with diminishing marginal utility by picking low-hanging fruit, expanding subsidies for cheap and effective measures, decoupling the standards from their energy efficiency, efficiency house standard, which is quite stringent. Heating system upgrades, this is a little bit speculative. I would like to do more research on this, but it seems as though given current energy prices in Germany, a transition to a middle step, shall we say, to renewable ready gas systems could be a viable option. And then maybe one more point regarding stochasticity. Central and state governments could commit to annual quotas in energy efficiency investment. And they own a lot of buildings in Germany, so 1.1 million social housing dwellings. And this would be a concrete step to prop up the housing market, irrespective of what's going on with energy prices. And it could be just a signaling indicator for the rest of the renovation market. In terms of next steps, I want to refine and expand this wealth model. So I consider it a pure multiplicative dynamic, which is not realistic. Most of us experience a mixture of fixed income plus savings. And there's actually lots of data or lots of studies that have been done. There's a lot of data out there about how people save. And you see here, the wealthier you are, the more percentage of your income you're able to put aside each month, which grows. And so instead of a strict log function, you get a log linear function, which is an interesting mathematical object. So it'd be interesting to dive a little more into this and expand the kind of modeling here to incorporate more wealth quantiles. And then I would also like to understand if it would be possible to determine a Pareto optimum of social utility. So not just that you maximize the utility of the consumers in different wealth quantiles, but you minimize emissions along the way. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for your attention. These references will probably be more useful to you once the slides are uploaded, but I look forward to the discussion.
Anthony, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And this presentation provoked already a couple of questions here in our audience, which is great. There already have been two questions in the audience to Yuri's presentation, which I missed. I will come back to them later in the final discussion. But now for Anthony, there's one question. So someone is asking about the variation in heat, about the variation in interest for subsidies. Did you do, or somebody else, did you do an analysis of possible reasons for that? Does the access to subsidies change through years? Share an investment, time for approval, etc.?
Okay, so I mean, they're obviously, it's hard to, I think the largest problem we have is that I only have about 18 years of data. And if you want to start controlling for various variables, it becomes very hard to do this kind of analysis. I did run simple correlation analysis between, for example, subsidy and prices, and you see that there's a positive correlation. So when prices are high, interest is high. The correlation is about 30% for oil and 40% for gas. So when prices are up, people take up subsidies. So that's one concrete number that I can give you. Another factor is that there seems to be, for sure, a greater interest in subsidies right before new building regulations kick into effect. So you probably don't have the graph in your mind anymore, but there was a huge spike in 2006 compared to 2005 and 2007. And that's because new building regulations, which were stricter, kicked into effect in 2007. And so everyone rushed in to get their renovations before these stricter regulations. So it is true that there are other factors at play with regards to subsidy interest. The larger point that I was just trying to make is that there is a stochastic element, and that subsidy interest is positively correlated with prices, and I think that's very important for the social planner to know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's another question. You said that deep retrofits remain unviable. Have you run in your model the scenario of stepwise deep retrofits or component-based retrofits?
I'm not sure what is. I think I understand what is meant by this, and I think the answer to this is no. I think this is a very interesting possibility. So my model was run, as I mentioned, I was looking for this optimal investment depth, but I was not able, at least in this stage of the modeling, to allow for the houses to be retrofit in stages. I think that would call for a level of sophistication that I was not able to bring into the analysis just yet. So the short answer is no, and the long answer is that I'm working on it. I'm working on trying to understand, because as I say, I mentioned right at the start that this baseline, this business as usual case is moving in time, and that makes modeling something over a 20-30 year period very complicated, because heating systems are being renovated, retrofits are being carried out, and so the element of this stepwise thing, it's very clear that it's real. Yeah, it's something for future work. So I appreciate the question.
Okay. And another one, which is really a bit provocative.
Yeah.
Others in this conference would argue for the opposite, that retrofit should only focus on the most ambitious, stringent, and costly standards. If it is not cost effective to go for these more ambitious standards, does that mean we decide not to do it?
Absolutely not. I think this is an excellent point, and it's good that it's provocative. It's good to have a little bit of a discussion around this. And maybe I can do a little bit of a tangent. One of the other motivations to this thing, which I didn't mention during my presentation, was I noticed a huge split in the literature between the economics journals and the building literature journals, where if you look at any economics review article on renovation, they come to the conclusion that these things, if anything, have only minor economic financial incentive, whereas the building literature is full of justifications, case studies about very positive returns, and this really bothered me. It bothered me even more because they seem to be working from the same model. They seem to be working from this discounted cash flow assumption. So how on earth were they coming to these diametrically opposed conclusions? And I think the point of economists is simply that we should be clear about the motivations. And I'm of the motivations for undertaking renovations rather. And I'm of the strand of thought that that if it is not economically viable, that we should face up to this fact and understand that the true motivation for doing this is to save the planet, to align ourselves with the Paris Agreement goals. And for that reason, I'm really glad to be sharing this panel with Uri and her talk, because we need creative financial solutions that can tackle these things. And this was one of the other reasons why I mentioned the government stepping in as a key actor and being able to absorb these non-financial, shall we say, ambitious projects over a longer term, something that the individual investor can't really absorb. So I think maybe to summarize, I would just say that to bridge the gap between these two strands of thinking is maybe the compromise should be not to argue or to find ways to make things be financial when they're not, or the other way around, but to somehow ask, like, what is the reason for us doing this? And if it's not financial, to like start with this fact and then discover ways to do this nonetheless. And so I appreciate the question. And it's something that I've had to think about a lot too. Because I did find that economists ended their papers on sometimes pessimistic notes, right? Sometimes saying, well, these things are uneconomical, so the market has clearly passed its judgment and there's no point pursuing it. And I think this is too quick of a judgment. I think the question should instead be, if they're not economical, what can we do to make them, right? To pursue this nonetheless. And that's been my personal motivation also. But I think clarity about the ground truth is just an important starting point.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Anthony, for this very interesting discussion. And maybe if we have some minutes left in the end, we might come back to this discussion of the two perspectives. I always call it a bit hardcore economic perspective on the one hand side, and then the technical engineering climate policy perspective from the other side, and how to bring them together. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, and now we switch to the third presentation in this slot, which is provided by Katarina Korytarova. Katarina is working for the Institute for Forecasting at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. From my understanding, you are based in Bratislava. I hope that this is correct. And Katarina is talking about financing renovation of public buildings in Slovakia. You have the floor.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about financing of renovation of public buildings in Slovakia. There's about 12,000 public buildings in Slovakia. And although there have been several programs, majority of these buildings still need major renovation. Majority of the programs have no ambitious energy requirements, and this leads to lock-in effect. This is also because there's a rather weak provision in the EPBD for major renovations. Another problem is that no stable national financial mechanism exists in Slovakia, which would have strict energy requirements. The aim of this talk is to provide overview of financial mechanisms for public building renovation, to point out at the risks and opportunities of large-scale retrofit, to summarize lessons learned from Slovakia, to provide examples from abroad, and to draw some recommendations. The support programs were evaluated in terms of finances and energy savings. First, data was collected based on working groups and monitoring systems, and the data was checked for the first time. Then the support programs were evaluated by each project. That means through bottom-up approach. Then the data was cross-checked through investment intensity, and if needed, verified by supplementary information about project and or contacting the beneficiaries. Finally, the results were developed through aggregation of the data. And here are the results. So in 2008-2016, about €1 million was invested in renovation of public buildings. Most of it, almost 90%, were stemming from EU structural funds. This investment brought about 1.2 petajoules of energy savings. Out of it, about 74% were also coming from EU structural funds. Out of the EU structural funds, it was mainly a regional operational program and operational program healthcare, which contributed the most. This is a scheme of support programs for renovation of public buildings in Slovakia up till now. In blue, we see EU structural funds or EU funding. Then we have Environmental Fund, which is national fund providing support for renovation of public buildings from 2014. It's mainly for municipalities and it comes from emission trading. Then we have other support programs or smaller initiatives. Majority of these support programs were in form of grants, but one, MUNCEF, which provided loans with bonus. However, only operational program quality of environment had strict energy requirements with enforcement. The environmental fund included energy savings as one of the selection criteria as of 2021. However, this is not a strict energy requirement. When we look into the future, there is a plan to spend about 370 million euros within the new operational program Slovakia for renovation of public buildings, and about 400 million from recovery plan, also from EU funding. However, half of this 400 million goes for renovation of listed and historical buildings. And recovery plan doesn't have strict energy requirements for renovation. It's assumed that environmental fund will continue providing support for municipalities. Then I'd like to talk about risks and opportunities of large-scale retrofit. So we know from several studies that there's significant energy savings potential in renovation of public buildings. This is example from Hungary and Slovakia, and it shows that there's a potential of 60 to 70% by 2050 if ambitious trajectory towards passive house buildings or nearly zero energy buildings takes place. So again, this requires strict energy requirements. However, if buildings are renovated massively to only conventional level of retrofit, there is a risk of locking effect, which can account for up to 2/3 of the potential of the ambitious scenario. This is example of Hungary. Moreover, some studies found out that the often promoted 3% annual retrofit rate is not so cost effective, and therefore it's worthy looking for some lower retrofit rate, which is cost effective. So in this study for Slovakia, we found out that the ambitious scenario is cost effective by 2050, not at 3%, but at 2.4%. Of course, this depends on national circumstances and other factors. So now I come to lessons learned. We learned, especially from evaluation of support programs, that majority of support programs did not have any or just weak energy requirements, except for already mentioned operational program quality of environment. And this may lead to locking effect. Also, this program, quality of environment, showed that functional sanction mechanism really works. So unless you fulfill energy requirements, you might be needed to return the support. What also proved effective is to have energy audit before and after renovation. In MUNCEF, the support increased with achieved energy savings, and this was motivational. We also learned from negative experience, and that was that the Bratislava region, which is classified as a developed region according to economic indicators, was excluded from EU financing. However, the public buildings in this region are in a similar technical state as the public buildings in other regions, as the whole public sector has been long underfinanced in Slovakia. And therefore, all of these buildings have been left without this significant funding. We also learned and experienced poor data quality. This was mainly due to the fact that energy savings, which were self-reported by beneficiaries, were not checked by energy specialists. Another experience is that investment into energy efficiency was not monitored separately in the projects with renewable energies. And all of these things made evaluation at national level harder and time demanding. Now I come to the examples from abroad. I put it into 3 groups. The first one, the green one, regards financial mechanisms. The German KfW provides a bonus which is dependent on achieved energy performance. It's interesting also because it's a national financial mechanism which covers or includes different programs under one roof. Then there is Czech operational program environment, which enabled renovation of public buildings into passive house standard. It was administered by State Fund for Building Development, which also included different programs under one roof, although the financial sources came from different sources. Then in blue, second group, regards legislation and how the energy requirements can be set by legislation. This includes the energy use reduction obligation in non-residential buildings in France, the Britain's minimum energy efficiency standard for rented property, and the Hungarian obligation for all renovations receiving public funding to fulfill some energy requirements. All of them have some sanctions. However, the Hungarian example shows that if there's not strong enforcement in place, it doesn't matter if it's even in legislation. It just doesn't happen. So the third group, orange, regards municipalities, and it shows us that also municipalities can set strict energy requirements for building renovation. In London Plan 2021, all major developments, including renovation, should be net zero carbon. And there are many other examples of municipalities which have already included energy criteria through public procurement. And now we come to recommendations. It's recommended, based on all of the above, that a national financial mechanism for renovation of public buildings with strict energy requirements and effective sanction mechanism is established. And only once the strict energy requirements are in place, the retrofit rate can be increased. This financial mechanism should have a long-term vision of contributing towards energy efficiency and climate change targets. It can be one institution with several financial sources. It's recommended that this financial mechanism supports only integrated EPCs, so no standalone. It's also recommended for the project level to have energy audits before and after renovation. Monitoring of energy savings should be at least 3 to 5 years after renovation, and this should be done by energy specialists. The investments into energy efficiency and renewable energy sources should be monitored separately. There are recommendations also for municipalities. They should create an inventory of buildings based on which they choose their investment priorities for renovation, based on which they develop a long-term investment strategy for renovation. And it's recommended highly that energy criteria is included in public procurement. So in summary, we've seen that there is a significant energy savings potential for renovation of public buildings. And there will be also financing for this renovation. In order to fully utilize this potential, or at least as much as possible, and to use the funding most cost efficiently, we should have a national financial mechanism with strong and strict energy requirements and strong enforcement. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarina, for this very interesting presentation and your very interesting input. So you developed a couple of proposals how governments and in particular the government of your country could improve the funding programs. Do you have any debates with governmental representatives? How do they react? So is there any chance to somehow integrate your ideas, your recommendations in policy?
Well, this article, this overview, it's been for the first time it's on the eceee, so I haven't published it yet before. However, these recommendations I already sent them to some, at least to 2 ministries. So I'm in contact with some employees at the Ministry of Finance and other ministry I wouldn't mention. So, and I'm also presenting these findings at conferences where there are some representatives. However, there hasn't been a discussion on this yet with them. But this would be definitely another step in the future. So also I was doing a little analysis of the Bratislava region for one ministry. So we are also discussing the necessity to include Bratislava region, despite the economic indicators, into EU financing scheme, because the public buildings are just not following the economic indicators which have improved in the recent period.
Is there any kind of support from other stakeholders for this kind of somehow adapting and improving funding conditions in order to make it more appropriate with regard to transforming the whole building sector towards climate neutrality or towards nearly zero energy standards? So is there any debate in your country about this? Is it an issue, or is it something completely new which needs to be somehow further developed over the next months and years in order to get it into a public debate?
Well, I think it has 2 layers. So first, this is not a new issue on the, let's say, European or global level. It's very well known that we need to move from shallow retrofit to deep renovation. So it's the locking effect is quite known phenomenon, I think. However, at the local level, at the national level, although it's also acknowledged that there might be a locking effect and that we need to support deep renovation. This is a more problematic, let's say, situation. And yes, it needs more discussion, but also I think more discussion that just doesn't help. So we need some concrete steps, and that's why I came up with these concrete recommendations, which I'm already targeting not only Ministry of Construction, which is responsible for building renovation, but also I'm in contact with another ministry which is responsible for the recovery plan, because it just I think it needs to be targeted from different angles, not just that. Anyway, it's kind of I think quite difficult situation in Slovakia to do this effectively.
There's a specific question from our audience here, from Gavin from the UK, who asked in the same sense, but he specifies, how do policymakers respond to your recommendations about stronger public institutions?
Well, as I said, it wasn't discussed yet at the kind of in a larger discussion with the ministries. But we have such a strong national financial mechanism for residential buildings. This is similarly to Czech Republic. It's State Fund for Renovation of Buildings. So it provides loans for multifamily buildings. So I think it's not it's not that unfeasible, and it's not such a novel idea to have a state mechanism, but it needs a political will to make it happen.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you very much. So there are a couple. So thanks to all of you three. So very, very interesting, very exciting presentations. I really learned. I'm not a financial expert, and I really learned a lot by reading your papers and by watching your presentations. There are a couple of still open questions from the audience, and I would like to use the final minutes to ask them. Though, to Yuri, there's a question to you. It was mentioned that your proposal would help the government streamline subsidy programs. Could you please explain this in some more detail?
Thank you for the question. So admittedly, we're not looking at public financing mechanisms. We're looking at private financing mechanisms. So basically streamlining, what we meant by that is redirecting the funds to low-income households, to public buildings, to social housing, and also to look for synergy between public and private investment when it comes to buildings that have tenants, that have many tenants and need agreement of all to carry out renovations and things like this. And also we are in discussion with the EIB on how to streamline private and public financing to find better ways. And at the moment we think mostly it's on the technical expertise. For example, the initial energy assessment is costly, of course, and this could be provided with a public subsidy. So this also creates an incentive to take out private financing.
Okay, thank you. Another question to you. Do you think that cheap primary resources for bank, so cheap money for banks, would be sufficient to boost the promotion of renovation market by banks? We have experienced it in France in the 2000s, also in the beginning of this what is it, millennium. It was not working. Maybe it was too early. So the question is, do you think that
Mhm.
providing cheap money to the market would solve the problem alone, or is it only one piece of a larger puzzle?
Oh, definitely. We are talking about the complexity, the being, uncomfortable when the renovation is carried out, the lack of technical expertise, perhaps even the construction market. So as we dive into the topic, it's really a very multifaceted problem, and funding alone, I mean, it could help, but there's a lot that needs to be done. And what we want is basically minimize the risk perception of clients by banks. So the interest rate that they put on the renovation loan at the moment, to what extent is it really the risk portfolio of that particular client? And to what extent it's the cost of administering that loan? So either way, if they get access to cheap subsidy, let's say, then banks, they are free on their own to determine the interest rate. So however negative rate they get, they can already put whatever interest rate they want. But our hope is that of course the rate will go down, and also it will make the market competitive. So perhaps there would be competition among banks to provide cheap loans for innovation. Yeah, so definitely funding is not going to solve everything on its own, but we want to see to what extent it would incentivize people to take out loans. Good question, yeah.
Thank you. And Anthony, there's also an open question for you. What about the current market failure that house prices are not tied to their energy performance? And what do you think are the necessary regulatory and market-based mechanisms to correct it?
This is a great question. It's not entirely my field of expertise, and I won't be able to offer a satisfactory answer, but maybe a few indications. I think yesterday at the informal session, there was a quite an interesting presentation about the change in property prices due to energy performance certificates. And the median sort of change was about 7%, and it varies between 3 and 8. And I did some more reading, and I found out people have tried to distinguish this in a more finer way, and they have come to the conclusion that in the upper segment of the housing market, that something like an energy performance certificate seems to matter more, and whereas if you come to the lower end, apparently the inverse thing happens, where you get a so-called brown discount, where the lower energy houses with lower energy performance, they go on the market for lower, either for renting or for buying, because they want to still be attainable. And at some point there will obviously be a tipping point, be it regulation or whatever, that will no longer make these brown discounts sustainable. But I walked away from this whole discussion very humbled at the complexity of this thing. So it's not so simple to just say, okay, if you have mandatory EPCs, that your price property goes up. It turns out that you really have to be careful as to what you're talking about. I think if in terms of regulation, the temptation is always to say, well, let's just have stricter building standards. Let's just update these standards more frequently. I think you could have unforeseen events like the one I alluded to earlier, where in the year before the 2007 standards in Germany kicked in, there was a massive spike in prices, a massive interest in subsidies, and these houses will now not be renovated for another 20 years, right? Because they just have these new measures installed. And so sometimes these subsidies, these sort of going at these problems with regulation can have backfired, can backfire, can also have unintended consequences. All of this to say that this is a really complex issue. The one thing that I am really happy about as an economist, and economists love carbon taxes, because that's like just a great way of internalizing an externality. And so in this case, the hope would be that the correlation between housing prices and energy prices would just somehow be tighter now, because energy prices now reflect the true value of the commodity, in this case the negative effect that they have on society. And so I think as someone who really leans a little more towards free market solutions, I think that's yeah, perhaps a smarter way to begin to tackle the problem, because it's always hard to backpedal when you have too much regulation, right? But it's easier to go at it from the left, shall we say? So just a few thoughts, but again, this is not my area of expertise.
Yeah,
Perhaps,
okay.
Mike, I see you smiling. Perhaps you have a few thoughts in this regard.
Of course, I have. I'm not an economist, but here I'm the panel leader, so it's not. I don't want to put my opinion here in the center of this discussion, but we do not really have the time to discuss that. But for me, it's really the question, because in particular, when I see from Anthony from your results that the wealthier people are, the less they refurbish the buildings and the lesser standards they go for. That's the point where I really ask the question, so doesn't that really call for regulatory activities and regulatory interference in order to get them doing what we expect them from do, because they seem to have the money for that, but they spend it for, I would say, for not the right things. They prefer to spend it in large cars, for instance, or whatever, large televisions, and not in energy saving measures in the buildings. And even when the richer part of the society is not really willing to spend their parts of their money into refurbishment measures, how can we get them really to do what we expect them to do, what the environment expects them to do in order to achieve the long-term targets? So that's yeah. So I'm a friend of regulations, but that's not shouldn't be the issue here. In order,
if I can add to that,
yes, of course.
just for me, it comes back to the taxes, that if subsidies are not the most effective tool for that class of people, the wealthier, then there is maybe room for taxes to tax the property size, and that leads to as a tool for energy sufficiency, or to make it work this way. Not that let's regulate, but let's do just a bit for those targeted. Yeah.
I have to say I've been very impressed with the creativity of policymakers in this regard, because I think starting quite recently in Germany, if you make modernization improvements to your home, you can claim it on your tax form, right? And I don't think there's been enough data to show what kind of wealth class people, I mean, and there's probably privacy stuff involved too, but how effective this has been, I'm not sure. But I think people have definitely been thinking about the kind of things you're talking about, Katarina. So just wanted to insert that thought.
But I think we can all agree upon the statement that it's, I think we need different approaches. We have different target groups. We need tax incentives, some other economic or market-based measures. I think we also need some regulation. So I think it's always a policy mix which is required in order to get the correct answer for each of the different requirements. And of course, we need the financing. That's correct. So thanks to all of you three. I learned a lot. That was really very exciting. I think to all who listened to your presentations, thanks for this excellent input, and thanks for the discussion and all your answers. So I need to make further announcements. Because today at 4:15, so 4:15, there is an informal session which is about showcasing the ABC21 project, which is looking at African and European bioclimatic designs and the use of local materials as methods to develop and promote sustainable buildings. And this is in a session in a meeting mode, so everybody who joins the meeting can talk to each other and have a discussion. So it's not a webinar; it's really a meeting room where you can meet and discuss. So that's the informal session at 4:15 today, and I think you find more details in the WUWA app. And there's also an end of day hangout at 4:15, where you can come and chat to other delegates over a glass of wine, maybe also a glass of beer, whatever you want. 4:15 alcohol, so quite early. So yeah, take that please into account. Panel 7 will continue at 12:30. At 12:30, we will start talking about delivery models. We have, again, exciting input from different panelists. So up to now, thanks to all of you, thanks to the panelists, thanks to the audience, and have a nice lunch. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.